Hi, my name is Richie Thaxton. I'm currently a PhD student at the University of Idaho. And today I'll be talking to you about a paper we recently published in August that investigated differences in cottonwood stands in the Green River system, but I think is very applicable to systems across the Southwest, both for the techniques that we use and the main take-home message, which is that cottonwood stands are at risk because of climate change and flow diversions. So first, I'd like to really thank the organizers of the symposium. I really appreciate you giving me a place to speak here. And I'd also like to thank my co-authors who, without their help, this paper and this research wouldn't be possible. And I'd also like to just take a moment to recognize that in the Green River system where we worked, that is the ancestral homelands of the Ute, the Cheyenne, the Eastern Shoshone, the Crow, the Timpanogos, the Southern Paiute, the Diné, Bikayas, and the Pueblos since time immemorial. So the main takeaways of this talk are that, first, that dendrochronology is a critical tool for monitoring and managing riparian forest resources. For those who aren't familiar, dendrochronology is the study of tree rings. If you take an increment core from a tree, you can look at the annual growth rings, and that tells you annual growth through time. So this helps you get an idea of not how only your forest is doing currently, but how your riparian forest has changed through time. We also show that radial and vertical growth differences between cottonwood stands are primarily due to differences in moisture limitation. For those who know cottonwoods and are familiar with riparian areas in the Southwest, this isn't a huge surprise, but how we detect these differences might be different than you might expect, which I'll explain a little bit later in the talk. And finally, the key take-home here is that cottonwoods in semi-arid regions are more vulnerable to future declines because of decreases in flow availability and increasingly hotter and drier climate. And these trees are capturing these changes with reduced growth. So for this study, like I said, we were working in the Green River system, and we were comparing cottonwood stands at 3 sites along the Green and the Yampa rivers. The first of these sites was at Deer Lodge Park and Dinosaur National Monument, right before Yampa Canyon. And this site was on the Yampa River, which is largely unmodified stream flow. There are some minor diversions in that part of the river, but it's more or less a naturalized system. As we move downstream, we core trees in Island Park, which is also in Dinosaur National Monument, but is downstream of the confluence between the Yampa and the Green Rivers. And so what's unique about this is that the Green River is heavily modified. We have Flaming Gorge Dam highlighted there, which has drastically changed the hydrology of the Green River. And finally, moving far down south on the Green River, not too far before it merges with the Colorado River, is a site in Canyonlands where we also sampled the riparian forest there. And so at each of these sites, we sampled 50 trees, taking both increment cores and other metrics. So, like I said, at each of these sites, we went around to 50 of those cottonwood trees. These were randomly selected in order to get a good idea of growth across the floodplain and across the entire forest, representative of the entire forest. And so we measured the tree height, the DBH, as well as the percentage of live canopy, which is sort of represented by that dashed line there. And in addition to that, from each of these trees, we took 2 or more increment cores using an increment borer you see there, that acts just as a hollow drill that allows us to extract the little wooden core you see there, and that's what we use to look at the ring widths of those trees. So From our just initial observations, we could tell that there were differences between the upstream forests at both Deer Lodge Park and Island Park compared to Canyonlands. This is true both in terms of percentage of live canopy, although it's a little bit harder to see. What this means is that the trees had less foliar area at Canyonlands compared to the upstream sites, although particularly between Canyonlands and Island Park. But where this difference really manifested was in tree height, where trees at Canyonlands were noticeably shorter than those at both Deer Lodge Park and Island Park. And so just as a visual representation of what that looks like, in the upper right we have the upstream site. This is directly below the confluence of the Green and the Yampa rivers. I cheated a little bit. This isn't the Island Park site exactly, but it is still, representative of what we were seeing there. We have people there for scale, just to give you an idea of how large and tall these trees actually were. And then we have some trees in Canyonlands. Further downstream, again, we have a person, that's actually Mike Scott, who's also giving a presentation, circled for scale. And what we see is that the trees are both shorter and the canopy is less full. We can see a lot of dead branches, a lot of dieback, indicating to us that this part of the riparian forest isn't doing so well as it is upstream. When we look at the increment cores and the radial growth of the trees, we see a similar story. Although particularly when we look at the growth curves for each of these sites. So for these, using the increment cores and the ring width measurements, we can get what is known as a site growth curve, which allows us to understand how cottonwoods grow as a function of age rather than through time. So, for example, when a cottonwood is established early on, we see a high growth rate, and that growth rate generally declines through time. And this is typical of most trees. As you're trying to put on additional rings across a increasing circumference around the tree, ring width is going to tend to decline with age. What is notable, though, is that the growth curves at each of these sites are similar till about 30, 40 years of age. So cottonwood trees from around establishment to 30, 40 years of age are growing similarly at each of these sites. However, at the Canyonland site, remember that downstream site, that's when growth tends to diverge. Those trees, when they're reaching about 50 or so years of age, their growth is significantly different, significantly less than those upstream. So these trees are growing slower as they're getting older, which is not expected given the other sites. And this trend continues until about 80, 90 years, where we don't quite have the sample depth to be confident that the trend we're seeing is real, but it is there in the dashed line, in case you're curious. Now, I alluded to that these differences are visible and are related to moisture variability. The reason it's sort of surprising, and the reason we had to dig a little bit deeper to understand this, is that when you look at the annual growth as a function of calendar year instead of age, we don't see these differences in growth between the sites. Again, the pink is in Canyonlands, but there's very few times where growth at Canyonlands is significantly different than that at Deer Lodge Park and Island Park. And so you can't just use ring width measurements as they are. You have to take into account that the trees of different ages are entering the chronologies through time, and to understand and to identify why these differences, these structural differences in tree height and canopy percentage are occurring. And so how do we know these differences are linked to water availability and not due to, say, nutrients or something else? Well, here we can rely on the ring width measurements and just do a simple correlation between stream flow and radial growth. Each of the black lines here is the discharge at that particular site, the river flow at that particular site. And the colored lines are the ring width measurements, the radial growth of each of those trees. And as you can see, there's a strong relationship at each of these sites between radial growth and stream flow. So strongly suggesting that, yes, stream flow is the limiting factor of growth in each of these sites. Now, how do we know that the decreased height at canyonlands is due to moisture availability? So there's a rich literature on hydraulic constraints, how hydraulic constraints can result in structural limitations in the tree, which and reduced vertical growth in the tree. But another way to look at it is to look at the tree's topographical position compared to the river, and see if there's a relationship. So what we did here was we found the height above the water surface for each tree, and then correlated that with the height of that tree. And what we would expect is that trees higher above the river are going to be shorter. There's a longer hydraulic pathway for the tree to move water from the ground up to the crown, which is more difficult if you're a taller tree. So at both Deer Lodge Park and Island Park, we see this expected relationship. We see that as trees are found higher above the water surface, they tend to be shorter in order to deal with that longer hydraulic pathway. This is not the case at canyonlands, however. What we see is that regardless of sort of where you are on the floodplain, tree height it shows no relationship to its topographical position. And this indicates that moisture availability is limiting across the floodplain because it's not a function of its topographical position. All the trees are water stress as opposed to just those trees furthest and highest above the stream. So then, what does the future hold for cottonwoods, given that we see these growth differences and it is due to water availability? What does water availability look like in the Green River system? Well, first we know that due to climate change, things are getting hotter and drier. At the Canyonline site, we don't see a huge difference in precipitation compared to Deer Lodge and Island Park, at least in the observed record. Yes, there is less precipitation at canyonlands, but there's no apparent a downward trend that we can tell just based on the observed record. Where we really see these differences is when we're looking at average temperature and maximum vapor pressure deficit. Where we see this, at all sites we see an increase in temperature since 1900, and likewise, that is driving the increase in maximum vapor pressure deficit through time. And where Island Park and Deer Lodge Park are fairly similar in annual temperature, that is not the case at Canyonlands, which is considerably warmer because it is farther south. Not only that, but another risk factor here is that more water is diverted by the time it gets to Canyonlands and the riparian forest there. And so what we see here is that a greater percentage of the stream flow at Canyonlands is removed. And we did this by comparing the observed stream flow to the naturalized stream flow, which is naturalized stream flow is stream flow with the effect of diversions removed. And we see higher percentage of stream flow being removed at Canyonlands and a larger increasing trend than at the other sites, which indicates that if these, it's only going to become more of a problem moving forward if these trends continue, given that the trees at Canyonlands already seem to be water stressed. Not only that, but the trees themselves seem to be responding to this decreasing water availability, which we showed in the ring width and the tree height. But when we look at the running correlations with maximum vapor pressure deficit, these are 15-year running correlations, we see that Canyonlands is the only site that through time there is a clear trend in its relation in ring width, the relationship between ring width and maximum vapor pressure deficit. We see both fluctuations through time at Deer Lodge Park and Island Park, but these hover around a consistent mean. On the other hand, we see the downward trend between the correlation of ring width and vapor pressure deficit in Canyonlands through time, indicating that these trees are not only becoming more water stressed, but they're becoming more affected by the hotter and drier climate that's there. And so, although I focused a lot on Canyonlands National Park, Dinosaur National Monument, this is not the only place where cottonwoods are at risk because of increasing temperatures and flow diversions. Radial and vertical growth measurements are really going to play a key role for managers moving forward in order to evaluate how their riparian forests are doing and to have the evidence needed to engage in management practices that keep these forests intact and avoid large declines. So if you have any questions about this, please let me know. I always check this email there. And if you would like to see more about the paper that we published, you can scan that QR code. That'll take you to the paper. Unfortunately, there is a paywall, but if you send me an email, I'd be happy to send you a PDF version of that document. So yeah, thank you very much.